Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you again to our lecture series, The United States in World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond, here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I'm Klaus Lares and I'm the holder of the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professorship in History and International Affairs here at UNC in Chapel Hill. Once again, I would like to thank our generous sponsors for supporting this lecture series. Please sign our mailing list with your email address if you would like to remain informed about our series. All our talks and lectures are also available for free on our YouTube channel. Don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel and please watch the talks as often as you possibly can. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC and Krasno with a K. Our talk today focuses on a perennial problem that has plagued mankind for a very long time. This is the issue of human rights. In particular, since the end of the Cold War in 1990, human rights, that is the neglect and violation of human rights, has become an ever more pressing problem. As you know, events in the Balkans in the 1990s and right now, while I speak, in the Middle East and elsewhere have led to airstrikes by the United States and many other countries, not least to overcome appalling human rights violations. The issue of human rights, however, was also of great importance during the Cold War years. Only during the Cold War, the violation of human rights seemed to receive much less attention than seems to be the case today. I'm therefore very pleased that our speaker today will illuminate the role of human rights during the Cold War. It is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Snyder of American University in Washington, D.C. Sarah is a historian of US foreign relations and she specializes in the history of the Cold War, in human rights and the US human rights policy. Her book, Human Rights Activism and the End of the Cold War, a transnational history of the Helsinki network, analyzes the development of a transnational network devoted to human rights advocacy and its contributions to the end of the Cold War. The book was published by Cambridge University Press and won 2 prestigious book prizes given out by the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Sarah Snyder's second book, Human Rights Before Carter, explores the development of an American human rights policy during the long 1960s. And the book will eventually and hopefully soon be published by Columbia University Press. As you will have guessed, Sarah is a highly prolific author. She has also written numerous book chapters and journal articles in scholarly journals such as Diplomatic History, Cold War History, Human Rights Quarterly, Diplomacy and Statecraft, Journal of Transatlantic Relations, and many, many more. Before recently joining American University as an assistant professor in the School of International Service, Sarah Snyder was a postdoctoral fellow at Yale and she worked as a lecturer in international history at University College London in the UK. I'm delighted that Sarah could visit us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Snyder to UNC. Sarah will talk about human rights and the Cold War. Did anyone care? Sarah Snyder.
Also, the first row is wide and available to anyone who's looking for seats. Thank you all for coming here this afternoon and also for the invitation to come to UNC and to talk to you today about my work on human rights during the Cold War. So, the existing scholarship on human rights in the Cold War has repeatedly pointed to 2 human rights booms, one in the late 1940s and one in the 1970s. And the implication of much of this work has been that few people paid attention to human rights until Carter became president. However, I see this pattern as much more undulating, and I argue that moments might be a more useful framework for understanding when human rights emerged as a priority in international relations rather than talking about these 2 booms. I think we should think about the Cold War as bookended by 2 major human rights developments, agreements to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the influence of human rights advocacy on the end of the Cold War. But in between, attention to human rights internationally, it was inconsistent and it was often overshadowed by the perceived stakes of the Cold War in political, military, ideological, and economic terms. But as I hope to demonstrate today, people at the time did care, and these human rights moments, I think, warrant greater attention by scholars. So building upon the United Nations Charter's affirmation of respect for human rights, in 1947, the UN Human Rights Commission began drafting a document that outlined international human rights norms and protected individual freedoms. Members of the Human Rights Commission considered the foundations of their undertaking to be the devastation of World War II and former U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's call for a post-war world dedicated to the preservation of 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The Commission struggled for many months in the context of increasing East-West tension and rising conflict in other parts of the world to formulate a declaration to which everyone would be morally bound. The United Nations General Assembly adopted and issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10, 1948, establishing an international human rights standard. The Declaration included 30 articles, enumerating specific rights. The first article declares all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The remaining articles address 3 broad classes of rights. First, the integrity of the human being, or freedom from government intervention against the person. Second, political and civil liberties. And finally, economic and social rights. This first category includes things like the right to life, liberty, and security of person, and specifies the freedom from slavery, torture, arbitrary arrest, or detention. The political and civil freedoms outlined included the right to own property and freedom of religion and expression. The Declaration also addresses economic and social rights, such as the right to employment, education, housing, medical care, and food. And 48 countries voted in its favor. 8, including South Africa, Saudi Arabia, the Soviet Union, and its allies, abstained. Importantly, no country opposed the Declaration outright. Consent to the Declaration was an important step for the promotion of human rights internationally, but it did not guarantee that its provisions would be fulfilled consistently. Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of this 1948 adoption, the record of implementation of the Universal Declaration was uneven, as the issue of human rights became increasingly politicized. In the 1950s, the attention of policymakers turned away from human rights declarations and institutions to waging the Cold War. In the United States, this was particularly fueled by the Bricker Amendment controversy, which built upon fears that international human rights treaties could undermine the Constitution. Post-war recovery, the end of the American atomic monopoly, the Chinese Civil War, the outbreak of war in Korea, and Third World nationalism all warranted greater attention. Nonetheless, the Universal Declaration expressed a commitment to uphold certain principles that retained a type of soft power throughout the Cold War. Do the two of you want to come and sit down? It's fine if you want to stand, but it makes me feel uncomfortable seeing you standing in the back there. Renewed attention to human rights internationally was heavily influenced by the establishment of Amnesty International in 1961, which directed international attention toward the plight of political prisoners and violations of human rights more broadly. Amnesty International was a participatory organization that worked to advance the cause of human rights despite the political context of the Cold War. Under Amnesty's model, fees-paying members formed groups that adopted specific prisoners of conscience. Over the subsequent decades, Amnesty International's members drew attention to the issue of political imprisonment through letter-writing campaigns. Every group adopted 3 prisoners, with 1 each imprisoned in the developing, communist, and Western blocs. Amnesty's 1-1-1 adoption model was intended to delineate that human rights activism was outside of the Cold War framework, as well as to demonstrate that low-level individuals could still make a difference in an era determined by high-level power politics. Amnesty International groups were then tasked with securing their prisoners' release through individual and group activism. Most often, group members wrote letters to officials responsible for imprisoning their adoptee, pleading for the easing of their conditions and the prisoners' release. Besides working for the release of these political prisoners, Amnesty was also devoted to ensuring trials were impartial and speedy, and that prisoners were spared abuse and unjust treatment. As Amnesty International evolved from an initiative begun in the UK by this man, Peter Benenson, chapters were established in Switzerland, Italy, France, and the United States, among other countries. In historian Samuel Moyne's view, Amnesty International was able to attract so many members because it offered an alternative outlet for those disappointed by the intransigence of the Cold War. Amnesty International's development fit into broader trends of growing concern about human rights, incarceration, and racial discrimination, as well as the rise of a global civil society in these years. Decolonization was also a significant factor in directing increased attention to human rights. In particular, historian Brad Simpson has emphasized the extent to which anti-colonial movements saw self-determination as the first right that must be secured and from which other human rights would flow. As decolonization expanded the number of UN member states, these newly independent countries brought with them an interest in certain human rights. As an outgrowth of the increasing African membership in the United Nations, two new committees were established in the 1960s. First, the Special Committee on Decolonization, and second, the Special Committee on Apartheid. Importantly, and in contrast with the Commission on Human Rights, both of these committees could listen to petitions and initiate investigations. One particularly significant moment in the wave of decolonization that focused international attention on human rights was Rhodesia's unilateral Declaration of Independence from Great Britain on November 11, 1965, which was intended to prevent black majority rule. In response, the United States, Great Britain, and others put in place an embargo to pressure the white minority regime, led by Ian Smith, to reverse course. The United Nations Security Council acted as well, passing Resolution 217, which disavowed the Unilateral Declaration of Independence and pressed Great Britain to resolve the crisis. The following year, the Security Council implemented economic sanctions against the regime. And independent African countries were particularly active in opposing Rhodesia's racially discriminatory regime. Cold War politics intersected with the international response to the Declaration in a number of important respects. The United States and others were attentive to black Africans' attitudes and wanted to attract newly independent states to the Western Bloc. Disavowing Rhodesia's unilateral declaration and racially discriminatory policies was one measure intended to garner their support. Ian Smith, the leader of the Rhodesian regime, however, sought to use the Cold War and his firm anti-communism to his advantage, suggesting the country could be an important bulwark against the spread of communism in southern Africa. The ongoing controversy, which was not resolved until 1980, focused considerable attention on racially discriminatory regimes. A similarly important moment was the April 21, 1967 Greek coup. The junta's human rights violations drew international attention, particularly given popular conceptions of Athens as the birthplace of democracy. The United States, Amnesty International, and members of the Council of Europe each acted to express their concerns about political prisoners, island concentration camps, and the use of torture in the months that followed. As in many cases, however, revulsion at Greece's human rights abuses was balanced against Cold War and security concerns. Greece's position as a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its strategic location in the Eastern Mediterranean muffled high level of recriminations. Nonetheless, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway all initiated action against Greece before the European Commission on Human Rights. Importantly, for marshalling international condemnation of the Greek regime, Amnesty International documented the torture of Greek political prisoners. Reports from its December 1967 and March 1968 visits to the country identified torture as a deliberate practice of the security police and the military police. In the United States, particular concern surrounded the fate of political prisoner Andreas Papandreou, who was a Greek politician with long-standing ties to the American academic community. Many well-known Washington-based liberals organized the United States Committee for Democracy in Greece. And this NGO was part of a broader network of groups and individuals in Australia, Canada, Denmark, Great Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the US, all of whom were opposed to the Greek regime. Now, as in other instances in which concern for human rights intersected with Cold War politics, the instinct of some high-level officials, which were often to ignore reports of abuses, were complicated by several factors. Concerned citizens, international human rights groups, and ad hoc NGOs succeeded in keeping attention on these human rights violations in Greece. Furthermore, Greece's location in Europe and its history meant that human rights abuses there were harder to overlook. Concerns about human rights violations in Greece persisted until the country returned to democracy in July of 1974. At the international level, the UN General Assembly's unanimous decision in 1963 to designate 1968 as the International Year for Human Rights in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Universal Declaration also raised the profile of the issue. The UN hoped that its member states would celebrate the year with postage stamps, some of which examples are here on the slide behind me, postage stamps, pamphlets on the Declaration, radio programming, and human rights prizes. The year culminated with the International Conference on Human Rights, held in April 1968 in Tehran. Now, there's a degree of irony at the International Conference on Human Rights site, given that the event's host, the Shah, did not respect civil liberties, and that many of the other states represented at the conference did not have exemplary human rights records. Those attending focused primarily on economic development and national liberation rather than individual human rights. And in historian Roland Burke's critical view, delegates from the Third World and even the UN Secretary General undermined the Universal Declaration in their speeches at the conference. In the assessment of the International Commission of Jurists, the US delegate Bruno Bicker and others, the conference was a failure. Despite such dire assessments of the conference, it was a moment at which international attention was focused on human rights. In Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact's 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia disillusioned many about the possibilities for progress and reform under the Soviet system. The invasion prompted a small group of Soviet human rights activists to protest in Moscow's Red Square. Those present were part of a movement that had begun in 1965, with a protest to commemorate the anniversary of the Universal Declaration, and carried forward with the establishment of the International Group, or the Initiative Group to Defend Human Rights in the USSR, and the Moscow Human Rights Committee. An important strand of those advocating for greater rights in the Soviet system were Jews, who sought religious freedom and, barring that, the right to emigrate to Israel. The plight of Jewish refuseniks, as those denied the right to emigrate were called, inspired considerable international sympathy. One of the movement's most prominent supporters was Senator Henry Jackson, a Democrat from Washington, who proposed legislation in 1973 to restrict Soviet American trade in an attempt to pressure the Soviet Union to issue more exit visas to Jews. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, as the legislation was called, became law despite administration opposition. And it angered Soviet leaders who ended up reducing rather than increasing emigration. Furthermore, in these years, Soviet authorities remained effective in suppressing dissent. Another key human rights moment was the significant burst of activism that followed the publication of the 1975 Helsinki Final Act in Soviet newspapers. This international agreement was the culmination of several years of talks among delegates to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and it was signed in Helsinki, Finland on August 1, 1975, by the Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and 34 other world leaders. The Helsinki Final Act inspired the formation of human rights monitoring groups across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The first group to form was the Public Group to Promote Fulfillment of the Helsinki Accords in the USSR, which was formed by 11 Soviet dissidents on May 13, 1976. Known in the West as the Moscow-Helsinki Group, it monitored Soviet compliance with the Helsinki Final Act, with particular attention to the USSR's record on civil and human rights. The group's 11 founding members represented different strands of Soviet descent. There were Jews who were denied the right to emigrate to Israel, there were human rights activists, and there were representatives of national minorities, such as Ukrainians. Yuri Orlov, a physicist who was barred from working in his field due to his human rights activism, became the group's leader. And this is a photograph of Orlov once he was in internal exile as a result of his activities. The group was under pressure from Soviet state security even before its formation was formally announced. Thereafter, group members monitored the Soviet record, and they based their reports on interviews, fact-finding missions, and other available evidence. They compiled numbered documents, and on this side there's an example of one of those documents, detailing instances of Soviet non-compliance, addressing issues as varied as national self-determination, the right to choose one's residence, emigration and the right of return, freedom of belief, the right to monitor human rights, the right to a fair trial, the right of political prisoners, and the abuse of psychiatry. In time, the group reported on the arrests of its own members. The Moscow-Helsinki group's establishment was critical to the development of the transnational Helsinki network, which shaped East-West diplomacy in the subsequent years. Groups such as the Moscow-Helsinki group and the plight of its members, such as Orlov, inspired many others to join in pressing for Helsinki implementation, and through their sacrifices exemplified the harsh repression of the communist regimes. Additional monitoring groups subsequently formed in the Soviet republics, such as Georgia, Ukraine, and Lithuania, as well as beyond Soviet borders. The Charter 77 movement in Czechoslovakia was one of a number of other human rights initiatives inspired by the Moscow-Helsinki group. 2 years after the Moscow-Helsinki group's establishment, in the context of increasing international attention to Soviet and Eastern European compliance with the Helsinki commitments, and growing activism by non-state actors on human rights, a United States-based monitoring group made up of private citizens was formed. This was Helsinki Watch. Helsinki Watch supplemented the developing transnational network devoted to implementation of the Helsinki Final Act. As it later expanded its coverage to Latin America, Africa, and Asia, the organization took on a new name, Human Rights Watch. Now, with Amnesty International, it is one of the two most prominent human rights organizations internationally. Helsinki Watch at the time was effective in focusing international attention on violations of human rights in Eastern Europe by writing comprehensive research reports that were relied upon by policymakers, journalists, and others interested in the issue. The group succeeded in reaching mainstream audiences as well as elite actors by issuing press releases, writing op-eds, and speaking out publicly. Like Amnesty International, Helsinki Watch offered support to monitoring groups and individuals in Eastern Europe, which reinforced its transnational connections with human rights activists there. In addition, in 1982, Helsinki Watch facilitated the formation of the International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights, an umbrella organization of Helsinki monitoring groups across Europe as well as in North America. The IHF, as it was called, strengthened links with individuals and groups active on Helsinki implementation in Western Europe, enhancing the weight of the monitoring group's criticisms with diplomats and Eastern European political leaders. and it also ensured that Helsinki activism would persist at a time of increasing repression in the Soviet bloc. Now, throughout much of the Cold War, there was an important distinction between human rights violations faced by those residing in the global north versus the global south. Although abuses such as torture, the denial of civil and political liberties, and impingements on religious freedom affected individuals indiscriminately, those in the global south faced far greater levels of abuses, racial discrimination, and challenges to their self-determination due to colonialism. General Augusto Pinochet's violent overthrow of democratically elected Chilean President Salvador Allende on September 11, 1973, and the abuses that followed shocked those concerned with human rights. Allende's death during the coup by suicide was followed by the murders of around 1,500 of his supporters in the first 6 weeks of the new regime. Overall, it's likely that 3,200 political opponents were killed, with tens of thousands more imprisoned, tortured, or exiled. Historian Patrick Kelly has written, "The Pinochet junta affected a tremendous growth in a global human rights inflected consciousness, as solidarity activists concerned with rights abuses in the Americas began to latch on to the rhetoric and ideology of human rights as a means to galvanize the world against state repression." The testimonies of opponents of Pinochet's regime gained an international audience and circulated widely. The rapid transmission of information drove attention to the Chilean case, and the use of evocative testimony enhanced solidarity for those suffering in Chile and elsewhere. Although in political scientist Catherine Sicking's view, the Cold War impeded or delayed efforts to press for human rights in Latin America, widespread concern at human rights violations in Chile presented a moment at which many moved beyond traditional concerns about communist infiltration in Latin America. According to Sicking, regional and international indignation was prompted both by the brutality of the coup, including bombings of the presidential palace, which is shown here in the slide behind me, and the public nature of the military's repression, such as mass imprisonment of political opponents in the National Stadium, as well as by the socialist experiment abruptly cut short under Allende. Attention to human rights abuses by Pinochet's regime increased scrutiny of military dictatorships elsewhere, including Brazil and Uruguay, and in later years, the disappeared in Argentina, and victims of paramilitary death squads in Central America would complicate traditional Cold War alliances. Beyond southern Rhodesia, one of the most significant examples of racial discrimination was the repressive system of apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid garnered international attention and condemnation when in June 1976, around 12,000 secondary school students from Soweto, a township in South Africa, marched to protest the requirement that they be educated in Afrikaans, seen as the language of their white oppressors. The hardline police response led to widespread rioting, casualties, and property destruction. It also riveted international attention on South Africa's system of racial discrimination. Internally, the riots signaled a more militant anti-apartheid activism. Regionally, the South African response prompted isolation. And internationally, South Africa was subject to widespread condemnation, including an arms embargo imposed by the UN Security Council. Even United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, no strong supporter of human rights, expressed his hope that apartheid would end in the riots' aftermath. The Soweto riots and the subsequent death of anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko in police custody galvanized opposition to the regime. External actors sought to exert pressure through reducing sports contacts, this was cutting off the tours of rugby and other sports teams of South Africa, limiting economic links, introducing codes of conduct, and imposing sanctions. Although Soweto and the government's response marked an initial burst of international attention, unlike other human rights moments in the Cold War, it prompted prolonged and sustained anti-apartheid activism in the subsequent years. One of the most egregious violations of human rights during the Cold War was the Cambodian genocide, which was facilitated in part by the geopolitical dynamics of the late Cold War. In the aftermath of its seizure of Phnom Penh, the Cambodian capital, on April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge revolutionary movement declared the establishment of democratic Kampuchea. By cutting off Cambodia from the world, the Khmer Rouge inhibited international awareness of the devastation there, and thus the years of genocide in Cambodia did not attract as much international attention as arguably they should have. In the course of a massive restructuring of Cambodian society, approximately 1.7 million Cambodians died out of a total population of around 7 million. U.S. officials and others found stories of the atrocities in Cambodia hard to believe, but they also maintained that little could be done to address the crisis. Kissinger and President Gerald Ford spoke out against the bloodbath and the atrocity of major proportions taking place in Cambodia. But their pronouncements were treated with skepticism, given the administration's credibility problems and the earlier U.S. record in the country and region. Jimmy Carter's administration, which might have been expected to respond more forcefully to the genocide, prioritized normalization with China over criticizing Cambodian human rights abuses. Carter did call the Khmer Rouge the worst violator of human rights in the world today, but didn't take action to match that rhetorical condemnation. The self-imposed isolation of the Khmer Rouge made it difficult for external actors to influence the Cambodian regime. In addition, fresh memories of the costs of intervening in Southeast Asia also limited the scope of action considered. The Khmer Rouge's killings were only stopped by a Vietnamese invasion in December 1978, which began the Third Indochina War. A high point for those who hoped human rights violations would be taken more seriously at the international level was U.S. President Jimmy Carter's 1977 inauguration. Carter made respect for human rights a central element in his foreign policy, asserting that during his presidency, the United States would pay greater attention to the issue in its foreign policy. Immediately, he undertook several high-profile actions, including corresponding with Soviet human rights activist Andrei Sakharov and admonishing Eastern European governments over their repressive activities. Carter was motivated by a range of political and moral impulses. First, faced with an eroding domestic foreign policy consensus, Carter believed that championing human rights could help gain him political support. Second, in the wake of the Vietnam War, American international prestige had suffered, and Carter concluded that support for human rights could change the United States' reputation. Third, the issue could serve as an effective rhetorical tool in the Cold War struggle with the Soviets. And finally, Carter's commitment was grounded in his religious and moral worldview. Carter sought to pressure states to improve their respect for human rights through reducing economic aid, as well as reducing assistance from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Now, under previous administrations, the United States had overlooked the poor human rights records of its allies in the Philippines, South Korea, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina, to name a few. But Carter's presidency presaged a new approach to U.S. foreign relations, one which would no longer be captive to a Cold War framework when considering foreign governments' human rights records. Historians David Schmitz and Vanessa Walker argue that Carter intended to create a post-Cold War foreign policy with his emphasis on human rights. But despite Carter's rhetoric and several early steps to institutionalize attention to human rights in U.S. foreign policy, his commitment to the issue was overcome by recognition of the limits of American power, arms control negotiations, and other Cold War priorities. His more muted approach can be identified as early as the July 1977 adoption of a presidential review memorandum that outlined a more circumscribed human rights policy than had been pursued initially, in part because it had complicated American relations with many governments. After the adoption of its Human Rights Presidential Review Memorandum, the Carter administration was more careful not to single out particular countries and emphasized the global nature of its focus. Nonetheless, his attention to the issue captivated the American public and others, making it difficult for subsequent administrations to abandon his commitment completely. The 1980s were not characterized by widespread improvements in human rights. As apartheid persisted in South Africa, Poland declared martial law to repress the trade union Solidarity, and widespread extrajudicial killings marked civil wars in Central America. The moment that garnered the greatest international attention, in part due to the presence of international broadcasters, was the Chinese crackdown on protesters in Tiananmen Square. Chinese students gathered in Tiananmen Square to mark the death of a popular Chinese leader on April 15, 1989. The ongoing demonstration became a forum of protest for various freedoms and reforms, and the crowd swelled to as many as tens of thousands. Protests, including several hundred hunger strikes, were heightened by Mikhail Gorbachev's state visit. After his arrival on May 15th, the crowd in the square may have exceeded 1 million. On the night of June 3rd into 4th, the People's Liberation Army stormed the square with tanks, crushing the protest with terrible human costs. It remains difficult to establish how many were killed in the crackdown. The Chinese government has asserted that injuries exceeded 3,000 and that over 200 individuals, including 36 university students, were killed that night. Western sources, however, remain skeptical of the official Chinese report, and most frequently cite the toll as hundreds and perhaps thousands killed. The crackdown was widely reported in the international press and covered to particularly dramatic effect by CNN. The image of a lone man, shown here behind me, facing down a line of tanks resonated widely as an archetypal picture of the repressive nature of the Chinese government. Although the United States was willing to move beyond Tiananmen quickly for the sake of other aspects of Sino-American relations, other countries were more hesitant to return to normalcy in their relationship with China. Before Tiananmen, attention to human rights in China was episodic, such as in response to the 1987 protests on Tibet, or focused on long-term issues such as religious freedom and the use of torture. After Tiananmen, the Chinese human rights record garnered closer and more sustained attention by governments and NGOs alike. A more positive and even triumphal story has been told about the significance of human rights to international relations in the other critical sphere of communist control at the time, Eastern Europe. Efforts, in particular to improve the lives of those living in the Soviet bloc, had a long history, but finally came to fruition on January 19, 1989. On that date, representatives at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe agreed to the Vienna Concluding Document, which included legitimate commitments to enhance religious freedom, facilitate the spread of information, respect the freedom of movement, and address human rights and human contacts in 3 subsequent conferences. The reforms implemented during the course of the meeting, which took place from 1986 to 1989, and its culminating agreement signaled a fundamentally new approach to East-West relations. In the months that followed, protest movements, inspired in part by Helsinki principles, reforms formulated in part to comply with the CSE commitments, and new leaders, many of whom were active in Helsinki groups, all came to the fore. The influence of the Helsinki process was both direct and indirect. Indirectly, ideas about human rights shaped Soviet and Eastern European reform. Directly, internal and external forces advocated for a new relationship between state and society in Eastern Europe, one that respected the rights and freedoms of the people who lived behind the Iron Curtain. In particular, Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev's program of reform was shaped by Western leaders such as U.S. President Ronald Reagan, Secretary of State George Shultz, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, as well as prominent foreign communists, his advisors, and even dissidents. In addition, Pope John Paul II's 1979 and 1983 visits to Poland, his anti-communism, and the Vatican's traditional support of religious freedom all influenced the course of reform in Eastern Europe. One of the most important ways that the Helsinki process enabled the revolution in Eastern Europe was through the development of a second society in the Soviet Union, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere. This second society was comprised of people committed to a wide range of political and social causes, including human rights activism. And their participation in this uniquely prepared them to implement change and partake in post-communist governance in meaningful ways. Western states, organizations, and individuals supported these movements until Gorbachev's process of liberalization offered the opportunity for reform in Eastern Europe. And once a movement for reform began, organizations, activists, and the structures already existed to replace the Communist Party. A range of groups in Eastern Europe made up this second society. For example, in Czechoslovakia, Charter 77 and the Czechoslovak Helsinki Committee led protests for increased political freedom that quickly gained wider adherence. Václav Havel, a human rights activist and playwright who had risen to political prominence through his involvement in Charter 77, became a leader of these protests and then president of Czechoslovakia after the end of communism there. And this photo shows Havel in New York after he's president of Czechoslovakia, meeting with Jerry Leiber, who was the executive director of Helsinki Watch. In Poland, Solidarity transformed into a political party, and its leader eventually became president of the Republic of Poland. Activism devoted to labor rights, peace, the environment, and national identity also shaped Eastern Europe as it transitioned from communist rule. The end of the Cold War raised considerable hope among those in the human rights community that the issue would no longer be overshadowed by geostrategic concerns. Similarly, those disillusioned with or exhausted by Cold War competition anticipated a more moral approach to international relations that privileged concerns about individual human beings. A former Human Rights Watch researcher wrote, "The optimism unleashed by the end of the Cold War ushered in a period of expansion in human rights organizing." In the aftermath of the Cold War, transnational advocacy networks took up new issues. One example was the campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines, which was made possible in many ways by the end of the Cold War. In addition, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch gained greater geographic spread than ever before, increased financial resources, and considerable media attention. Yet the end of the Cold War, however, has not ushered in a radically different approach to human rights. Important disparities exist among non-state actors in terms of their access to resources, communications expertise, and influential figures. Furthermore, financial considerations and fears of international terrorism have replaced Cold War priorities as the concerns that now trump high-level attention to human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very enlightening and a tour de force about the entire Cold War and how human rights has influenced or not influenced Cold War decision making. Let me ask you an overall question to summarize your talk perhaps. How important were human rights in the Cold War, and was there any government during the Cold War years which was actually influenced by human rights in its foreign policy?
Meaning that human rights activists guided it in a way that it might not have wanted to go otherwise.
Exactly.
Well, first of all, there were some governments, particularly in Europe, who were very active on human rights issues. And I would say Norway, the Netherlands, there are a few countries who both in Europe and in a broader context were very active throughout this period and didn't seem to be as restrained by Cold War security concerns. In terms of governments who acted in a way that they might not otherwise have done so, I do think that the United States in several instances moderated its policy in response to human rights activism.
But even Jimmy Carter wasn't mostly influenced by the pursuit of human rights, was he?
No, actually, I mean, I wouldn't point to the Carter administration as a administration that did something it didn't want to do. In many ways, because of its rhetoric, it did not come under nearly as much pressure as its predecessors or successors, because there was the belief among its supporters that it would champion human rights. And if it didn't do as much as they might have liked on, say, China or Cambodia, first of all, you had to give them time, just wait to the second term, that's when everything will work out. But also, because the goals were seen as aligned with human rights activists, I don't think they ever came under as much pressure as, say, the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, or even the Johnson administration. The project that I'm working on now is called Human Rights Before Carter. Essentially what I'm trying to argue is that it's not Carter's coming into office that all of a sudden makes human rights a priority in U.S. foreign policy, but it's the work of non-governmental organizations and particularly members of Congress, people like Donald Fraser or Henry Jackson, who've been paying attention to this issue for many years. And through congressional hearings, through legislation, through efforts to shine a light on these abuses, are laying the groundwork for what the Carter administration is able to build upon. So I do think that you can look through the records and see that, for example, I mentioned Andreas Papandreou. It doesn't seem that the Greek government was going to kill him on the sort of eve of his arrest, but the Johnson administration cabled to Athens and said, make it very clear, President Johnson is aware of this political prisoner. They don't want him to be killed. This will cause enormous problems. And so I don't think otherwise Johnson would have done anything about what was going on in Greece if there wasn't the pressure from, ended up being sort of hundreds of economists who'd worked with Papandreou. He'd had academic positions in Minnesota and California, and they all started cabling the White House saying, you have to do something to prevent his murder. So otherwise, the United States, I don't think, would ever have gotten involved.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask you another question before opening it up. You know that the end of the Cold War, or the question who deserves credit for ending the Cold War, is controversial.
Yes.
But how important was human rights, was the Helsinki process for ending the Cold War? So did human rights end the Cold War?
Well, so this is the subject of my first book. I certainly think that human rights activism played an important role that people had not paid sufficient attention to before. That doesn't mean that I think that human rights activists are the only reason that the Cold War ended. But I do think that both through their direct advocacy, whether it was influencing the Reagan administration to care about human rights and make human rights be one of the four elements of the sort of four-part agenda that George Shultz developed, or it was the culture of ideas that developed in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, that I do think was influential in shaping Gorbachev's reform, shaping the thinking of some of his aides like Shevardnadze or Anatoly Chernayev. So I think that there was an important influence. That doesn't mean that human rights activists are the number one factor that led to the end of the Cold War. I think people like Reagan and Gorbachev were enormously important. The degree of trust that they were able to develop, the regular meetings, the fact that these different priorities were all integrated. They kept saying it's not linkage, but there was some form of linkage going on, as well as the activities of people, very brave, courageous people in Eastern Europe. So I think that they were quite important. I don't believe in the Reagan Victory School interpretation. I don't think it's just structural factors. It was just the poor state of the Soviet economy. I think humans mattered a lot, but I'm trying to make a contribution, not say that this is the only reason that the Cold War ended.
Okay, thank you, but I'm glad to realize that it wasn't just Ronald Reagan who ended the Cold War. Thank you. Questions, please. Yes, please.
Lisa, thank you. That was really interesting. So, when I was reading Steven Pinker's latest book. He had a chart about how often the word human rights has appeared in like all published literature, or a lot of published literature, including like media publications. And it kind of goes up pretty exponentially from the 1940s to like the 1990s, basically the course of the Cold War. And so what he kind of suggests is that this is a sort of growing groundswell popular awareness of human rights. How much do you think that played a role in? I mean, do you think that made like a big difference to kind of the growing popular consensus that human rights matter? Do you see that playing an increasing role?
I do think that matters. Awareness of the issue, people talking about it, it being something that you would want to be concerned with, I think is important. But I guess I would see other processes as potentially more important. One of them, in my view, is the achievements of the civil rights movement. Because it's very difficult to talk about human rights violations overseas if your own house is in such terrible shape. And I think that gave U.S. diplomats at the UN, it gave policymakers, it gave U.S. leaders, I think, feeling that they had more ground to stand on in saying, not only what you have going on in your country is bad, but also we talk about what's wrong in our country, we're working to make progress on this, and so I think that's one important thing. I think the decline in the foreign policy consensus with the Vietnam War was really important. A number of the members of Congress that I look at become disillusioned with U.S. foreign policy because of Vietnam, but also things like the intervention in Dominican Republic they're very concerned about the fact that that slide that I showed of Greece, that those are American tanks that are on the streets in Athens. So it's a broader questioning of US foreign policy, and particularly of Democrats standing up to Democratic leaders and saying, you know what, Lyndon Johnson, we don't agree necessarily what you're doing in Vietnam, and we also are going to ask questions about what's happening in Greece, in South Korea, and a whole number of other places. And the third thing that I would say is that I was talking about how quickly information is disseminated in the wake of the coup in Chile. And it's really important that people in New York call refuseniks in Moscow every week and try and make phone contact with them. These Helsinki Watch activists, they fly to the Soviet Union and they meet with the dissidents there. There's photographs that appear of them in Life magazine. There's telegrams that are going to Amnesty International's office in London overnight saying this person was arrested yesterday, and they are immediately sending out an urgent action bulletin to all of their groups to take some sort of steps to make awareness of this prisoner's plight known. So I also think the sort of transformation of transportation and communications networks that we see plays a key role as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
It seems like after the Cold War, immediately after the Cold War, and the humanities, human rights kind of took on a trendy, I always think trendy, but I do, effect, and in terms of international intervention in conflicts that were primarily human, or that had a lot of human rights violations, so like Bosnia, and just the conflicts that President Clinton, decided to have, or contributed to NATO's intervention. But I wonder if you would say that now human rights matters less. Does it?
Let me repeat it because I'm not sure if the microphone picked it up. Does human rights matter less today than it did, for example, during the Clinton administration and other administrations in the past?
Well, I want to begin with questioning a little bit the premise of the question. All of a sudden, much greater attention to human rights during the Clinton administration. I think now we don't remember how long it took them to intervene in Bosnia, and that there had been a significant period of discussion during the first Bush administration about intervening or not. And also the lack of U.S. action in Rwanda. So I don't think that we could say that the Clinton administration has a robust human rights policy. I mean, it's 8 years, it's a long time. There's things they got wrong and things that they probably got right. In contrast to now, I think that there is there's a significant difference in the extent to which high-level officials are willing to make human rights part of U.S. policy. I alluded at the end to financial considerations. Certainly, I think the shift in the Obama administration's approach to China, things like meeting with the Dalai Lama, bringing up political prisoners during missions to China, I think there's a real shift that's happened. And part of it is because of China's economic power. In terms of, there are other reasons I think that the Obama administration is not as outspoken. I would argue, based on our research on the Reagan years, that it's important that human rights always be part of the conversation if you're actually going to convince anyone that you care very much about the issue. You can't just do it, every 3 years and then maybe bring up something about human rights. Also, the administration waited a very long time to articulate any type of human rights policy. So I think it's a low priority for the administration. Lower or not than the Clinton administration, harder to say.
Thank you very much.
There's been a lot of, you did not in your talk particularly emphasize the role of various organized religions. And there's been a story going around that Zbigniew Brzezinski, under Carter I think it was a person who had the right name, the right affiliation and everything to see to it that a Polish gentleman was elected Pope, or that their fine Italian or fine American hand was in there somewhere. And I wonder if you could comment on that. Is it true that the Carter administration, as a proactive measure, tried to see that a Polish Catholic was made Pope, and what's your analysis of whether it was successful?
Thank you very much. So did Brzezinski and Carter make sure that a Polish Pope was elected, maybe to advance human rights as well? Yeah.
I would begin by saying that religious organizations were enormously active on human rights issues during the Cold War, very often for their own co-religionists, but it wasn't limited to that. Quite often they would be advocating the cause for religious freedom overall in a particular place. You have Jewish organizations in the United States, Baptist organizations in the United States who were concerned about religious freedom in the Soviet Union, and they're talking about the rights of a whole range of people who they want to be able to practice their religion freely. In terms of did Brzezinski have a hand in the election of a pope in the Vatican, I have absolutely no idea. I can't say that I've seen any records of the Carter administration on this issue, and I haven't heard any scuttlebutt from the Sistine Chapel either, so I can't say. Certainly, it did advance the administration's cause, and I think that the Pope was enormously effective as a moral voice on communism, and particularly, when I mentioned his 2 visits to Poland, in inspiring the cause of those people there. There's a book that's just come out on the question of Polish liberation from communism by Gregory Domber that I would recommend to those of you who are interested in this issue. And it's very much about the connections between Americans and Poles in the wake of the imposition of martial law and the move towards democracy in Poland.
Thank you. And of course, some people believe that the Pope ended the Cold War. Yep.
The question that you posed to the speaker about the cause or effect of human rights and events, I think might be also examined in the converse. Such a sudden and dramatic event as the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of East Germany affected millions and millions of people and their civil rights very dramatically. So I think one may be the cause in the opposite direction.
Thank you. So you have a question as well?
I'd like your comments.
Oh, that's it.
Well, I would say that, I mean, the first question was quite large, and I didn't address all parts of it. And I do think that not only did human rights activism play a role in the end of the Cold War, but it played a role in how the Cold War ended, particularly the peaceful way that it ended. And I mentioned the Vienna concluding document, and one of the key elements there was a commitment for freedom of movement. And the first countries to open up their borders with the West, Hungary with Austria, and other places where there was freedom of movement before the Berlin Wall fell, all cited their commitments in this Helsinki CSCE agreement as the reason why they were opening their borders. So I think it played an enormous role leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the sort of reframing that you've posed in the way in which the end of the Cold War influenced the spread of political and civil liberties, I think is very true.
Thank you. There's a question.
Thanks for showing that people, comprehensively, that people cared about human rights during the Cold War all along. I was wondering whether you could conceptualize more like what is the relationship between anti-communism and human rights for successive U.S. administrations? Or put bluntly, when did U.S. administrations and their foreign policy cared? I mean, in terms of, for example, in Germany, since the 1940s or late 1940s, U.S. policy towards East Germany and the Soviet Union is always couched in a language of human rights, whereas, as you've shown, I mean, in South Africa might be a different, or Athens, Chile is shown, like these local putschists strive or really go for the anti-communist moniker and try to elicit American support for that. When do they care? When do they not?
Well, it's certainly true that I would say that a number of administrations use issues of human rights against communist countries as a rhetorical tool. There's all sorts of metaphors in the documents about a hammer, a club, it's clear that they want to beat Soviets over the head with this issue. So everyone who's talking about human rights is not always doing so for unself-interested reasons and non-ideological reasons. In terms of when do human rights matter despite this Cold War division, I would say most during the Carter administration, and this is the great criticism of the Carter administration, that he only criticizes his allies. He only criticizes right-wing authoritarian regimes who are allies of the United States in the Cold War. He weakens them, potentially leads to greater instability and danger for the United States in the Cold War. In terms of other places where the United States champions human rights despite these communist dimensions, I mean, Rhodesia is one case that I would point to, because Smith's great claim was that his Declaration of Independence from Great Britain was just like the American Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. And he was a white Christian anti-communist who was going to prevent the spread of communism in southern Africa. I mean, at the time, the ANC was seen by its critics as a communist front organization. So there was the sense that he was going to preserve anti-communism in Africa. So there, the fact that the Johnson administration and subsequent U.S. administrations are part of a sanctions system against him, work to resolve the issue for a black majority government, I think suggests that, one, communism is not always the most important sort of grade that the United States is giving someone on a report card. But also that perhaps communism, anti-communism matters less in less strategic places. Greece is far more important to the Johnson administration because of its position in NATO, because of the need to be able to quickly potentially airlift supplies to Israel, because of the ports that the United States Navy uses. And Rhodesia, there's a little bit of chrome trade that's going on, but overall the United States doesn't have an important strategic or economic relationship with Rhodesia, and so it's easier to say we're not going to support your government.
Did you feel, or do you feel, that the Carter administration was also influenced by the domestic American civil rights problem? That Carter wanted to demonstrate his dedication to civil rights by also supporting the Rhodesian guerrilla movement? Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think, and there's a recent article about this in Diplomatic History by Simon Stevens, about how Carter's sort of coming of age politically and personally in the South during the civil rights movement shaped his thinking, particularly about South Africa, and how it was that South Africa could be induced to change. So I think very much not just the domestic politics, but his own personal understanding of the achievements of the civil rights movement, of the ways in which they were able to achieve these ends, shaped his thinking about white majority regimes. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
How do you think of the human rights in China, such as Chinese people cannot surf the internet freely? The Chinese government have built a great wall on internet, and people cannot get access to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And I think many young people they don't know the Tiananmen Square in 1989. And there's another question. Do you think U.S. government have two rulers on human rights? I remember there's a very famous cartoon from Chinese government. Uncle Sam, he has two books. One book is about human rights abroad, China, Iran, and one book is in the U.S. And he only looks abroad human rights, and he blind these eyes. How do you think of that?
Well,
Thank you.
In response to your second question, I would say that, and I alluded to this a little bit when I was talking earlier about how there needed to be progress on civil rights in the United States for the United States to feel like it could criticize other countries' records. And this is a strange sort of way of talking about things, but in the White House Central Files, up through the Nixon years, there's a category called human rights. And what human rights refers to are issues of equal access in the United States. Things like equal access to housing, to education, they're all domestic. And over time, human rights as a category becomes much more things like genocide and violations abroad. And so there's a change, I think it's clear in the language, there's a changing understanding of if there are human rights violations in the United States. Over time, I mean, we only really talk about civil rights violations in the United States. And human rights violations are something that happen elsewhere. So I think that there's some truth in what you're saying of this cartoon of two books. In terms of the first question, I think that I mean, you have correctly laid out a whole range of human rights violations that exist in China. I mentioned earlier, I think that the Obama administration should be making these violations part of its relationship and negotiations with China. I think it's a mistake to not do so.
Thank you. I didn't realize that our YouTube channel can't be received in China. That's terrible. We have to improve on that. Alyssa.
Sorry. So I wanted to tie a question to the one that Klaus asked you earlier about if human rights had to do with the end of the Cold War. And you talk kind of about this reified idea of human rights, as in the abuses by the Eastern Bloc. And I basically wanted to ask if you also think that potentially the end of the Cold War had to do with more of an ideological change as a result of the rise of human rights ideology. So, for example, looking at the New Left and Euro-communists, and if they're kind of like, and with the cultural turn, they're kind of becoming ascribed to more looking at human rights violations instead of like a strict Marxist-Leninist ideology, like for example Enrico Berlinguer in Italy. If you think that had to do also with the end of the Cold War as a result of kind of like lack of support in this strict Marxist-Leninist ideology on behalf of human rights.
One of the influences that I mentioned on Gorbachev certainly were Western European communist leaders who he visited, he met with personally, and they shaped his thinking about the reforms that the Soviet Union should be undertaking and how it was that he could find a way forward to liberalize economically, later politically. And so I think very much so they played an important role in shaping Gorbachev's thinking.
Thank you very much. Miles.
Yeah, I have a question relating to the end of the Cold War or events right after that. The International Criminal Court suddenly was created in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and to me that seemed to come almost out of nowhere after a half century since the last international criminal trials. But your talk has perhaps helped me understand how the International Criminal Court arose, that perhaps the discourse about human rights and all the concerns that you've talked about, that may have laid a basis for that court. Could you comment on that?
I can't comment on the court directly, but I would say that throughout the Cold War, particularly from the early 1960s onwards, the UN General Assembly is consumed with talking about human rights. If you read through the speeches at the General Assembly each year, they are talking about Rhodesia, they're talking about South Africa. In the 70s, they start talking about Israel as well. In a human rights, I mean, they're talking about it in terms of human rights. And it's almost the only issue that gets discussed. So I would say that within the UN, within the broader international community, there's always this great concern about human rights. I think critics would say it's only the human rights of certain populations. It's not necessarily broader human rights. And it's only happening in the General Assembly. It's not happening at the Security Council, or a place where these concerns could be acted upon because of issues of vetoes and a commitment to these issues at the Security Council. But so I do think that when we see international initiatives related to human rights, there has been a lot of support for them over time, and perhaps the end of the Cold War enabled that to happen. But I don't know as much about the origins of it.
Thank you very much. What do you make of that policy by human rights crisis? We see now ISIS in the Middle East, which needs to be defeated. That seems to be a sudden decision because of atrocious human rights violations. Is that a good basis for policy, or should we say yes, it is, because the people in that region need to have a much better human rights record to enjoy than they do at the moment? So, but should it lead Western governments to make human rights as their leading or their guiding principles for their foreign policy? What do you think?
I don't think that human rights should always be the guiding principle for U.S. foreign policy. At times there are more important considerations, and I acknowledge that even in the Cold War, it wouldn't have made sense for the United States at every year, in every context, to have put human rights as its single priority. I think often it seems to me that governments are responding to some past crisis in which they did intervene or didn't intervene, as opposed to having a much broader principle by which they decide the United States intervenes in these situations or it doesn't. And there's been a lot of research on, say, did the United States intervene in Somalia because of the CNN effect? And I think quite convincingly it's been shown that that's not what led the United States to intervene. But I think it's undeniable that now that we have such great awareness of human rights violations and humanitarian crises, there can be incredible pressure on the U.S. government to act. And it can be very difficult to explain why it's not in the U.S. interest to do so. I also think U.S. interests, as we know, evolve. And so what may not have been the best decision for the United States a few months ago might be very different, and the strategic situation changes. So I think it's a challenge. In general, when you don't intervene, people criticize you for not intervening. When you do get involved, then, I think that it can be difficult to win in some of these situations. They're very difficult decisions, and I certainly don't have all of the information available to be advising anyone what they should be doing.
Maybe the president will soon call on you to get some good advice. Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. It was great to have you here. Thanks for answering all our questions and, of course, giving us a great overview about human rights in the Cold War. I would like to invite you to come to our next lecture, which is on the 7th of October at 4 p.m. here in this room. And it will be Randall Woods of Arkansas University, and he will talk about the CIA and the Vietnam War. You're all very welcome. Please come along. Thank you very much for coming tonight.